Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Mathijs Klemm will defend his academic thesis, "We Can Work It Out, a study into an improved interpretation of current EU law to address VAT double non-taxation caused by divergent national decisions." Mr. Klemm, may I invite you to present a summary of your studies and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear Pro-Rector, esteemed members of the committee, dear friends, family, and colleagues. Anyone who has ever been to a football match will immediately recognize this situation. Two supporters watching the exact same game and yet come to opposite conclusions. Was it offside? Was the ball really over the line? The two supporters have seen the same thing. They know the rules of football. And yet, depending on their perspective, and possibly because of the color of their shirt, they come to opposite conclusions. This simple scene captures the essence of what my research is about. In the European Union too, two national tax authorities can establish the same facts, apply the same legal norms, and yet decide differently. For example, where a transaction should be taxed. In my research, I call this a decision-making divergence. Today, we're going to take a closer look at that concept and explore ways how to solve it. Consider the structure of the European Union, with its 27 member states, each with their own national courts, tax authorities, legal culture, and traditions. It is not difficult to imagine how uniformity gets lost in this cultural and institutional patchwork. Now, unlike football fans, tax authorities cannot simply agree to disagree and continue cheering for their own side. In a union of 27 member states, divergences have real consequences. Let's take a closer look at this example. We are looking at a situation between Belgium and Germany, with a company located in the border region of Belgium. The company has employees in Germany to which it leases cars, which those employees can also use privately. There's no doubt that this transaction should be subject to value-added tax. The question is, where? Luckily, EU law provides harmonized rules that allocate taxing powers between member states. The German authorities consider those rules and specifically focus on a rule for rental transactions. They also consider case law of the Bundesfinanzhof, the Supreme Court for Fiscal Matters in Germany, and who equates leasing transactions quickly with a rental transaction. And the German authorities are quick to conclude that we're looking at a transaction that should be taxable where the employees are located, in this case, in Germany. The Belgian authorities, however, may very well come to an opposite conclusion. They may find it more difficult to equate leasing with rental. As a consequence, they apply a different place of supply rule, one that stipulates the country where the supplier is established as the place of taxation. The consequence is double taxation, but in a mirror situation with slightly different facts, the outcome could also have been double non-taxation. Both results are harmful. Double taxation impairs fundamental rights, such as the right to property and sometimes the right to an effective remedy. Double non-taxation is also problematic. It hinders the attainment of the internal market and distorts conditions of competition. The paradox is striking. The European Union was based on the idea of removing barriers to trade. But when member states diverge in the application of that law, new barriers arise. Invisible barriers, but barriers nonetheless. So, what can be done? One option is reform, creating new rules, new procedures, even new institutions. And indeed, such proposals have been made, both by the European Commission and by academics. However, one should be mindful that taxation belongs to the core revenue of member states. And this is why the member states of the European Union require unanimity before they change the rules. So, while reform may be desirable, it's not necessarily politically attainable. So this led me to a different question. Can we work it out with the rules we already have, with the tools we already have? My research focuses on the combating of divergencies that either result into double taxation or double non-taxation, and the extent to which such situations can be effectively addressed under current law, so without new rules. My main findings are as follows. The best disagreement is, of course, the one that never arises in the first place. The member states can actually prevent divergence through the Court of Justice, who can issue rulings that are binding on all 27 member states. Such rulings harmonize the application of that law throughout the European Union. I also found, however, that the court's case law is sometimes unclear and even inconsistent. Such case law does not harmonize views, but rather aggravates the risk of divergences. In my view, the court should make clarity and objectivity as a priority. It should engage in deductive legal reasoning. It should explain apparent inconsistencies in its case law. It should be diligent when formulating foundational precedents. And, if necessary, it must, at its own motion, address divergences. By following these steps, the court can ensure that the rules are easier to apply on and thus easier to agree on. Yet, disagreements will always arise. And when they do, we need ways to solve them. Under current law, that usually happens through the preliminary ruling procedure, where national courts can ask the Court of Justice in Luxembourg for guidance. The court then functions as kind of a referee who decides what the correct interpretation of EU law should be and often helps to establish in what member state EU law was applied correctly and where it was not. However, the case law of the court is sometimes too general, leaving national courts and tax authorities room to interpret the judgment differently. I argue that the court should stretch its jurisdiction in these instances and provide outcome-oriented judgments that leave national courts and tax authorities little room to maneuver and little room to drift apart. Additionally, I find that national courts, even lower ones, should use their power to bring divergences before the court so that resolution can quickly be attained. In the context of double non-taxation, the situation is more complex. There's typically no actor who has incentive or opportunity to bring the case before the court. Therefore, I argue that a value-added tax committee should step up and coordinate procedures that can possibly resolve the divergence. In other words, national courts, members of the VAT committee, and the Court of Justice should take greater responsibility in resolving divergences. Now, not every disagreement has to end up in Luxembourg. Sometimes the member states themselves can work it out and settle the divergence in an early stage. The tax authorities must cooperate, exchange views, and generally consider each other's positions. Sometimes a tax authority can just simply adopt the position of the counterpart in another member state. I argue that this should not be seen as a political gesture, but rather as a legal duty to protect the right to an effective remedy. So in brief, administrative authorities must cooperate and sometimes mutually recognize each other's positions. But even after a divergence has been solved, the story is not over. The consequences need to be corrected or regularized. In the case of double taxation, where too little VAT has been paid, I argue that the taxable person should get that money back. In the case of double non-taxation, where too little value-added tax has been collected, the missing amount should be assessed. This sounds straightforward, but in practice it means that limitation periods and strict procedural rules sometimes have to give way to protect fundamental rights. In the case of double non-taxation, I argue that procedural principles of good government should be respected, even if that means that VAT remains uncollected in the European Union. So in short, time limits must be disregarded to regularize double taxation, while double non-taxation is harder to correct. The title of my thesis is We Can Work It Out. Some of you may recognize it as a song of the Beatles. I chose it not for its melody, although the melody is quite good. I chose it because its message of cooperation, mutual respect, and understanding, which seems to fit the reality of EU VAT law perfectly well. My thesis argues that double taxation can already be effectively addressed under current law, if member states and union institutions take their duty seriously to prevent and solve divergences, and if fundamental rights are taken as a guiding standard. By shifting the responsibility from the taxpayer to the tax authorities, my proposed interpretation gives member states and the union an incentive to act. And perhaps, finally, to bring the legislative ideas of the European Commission and some academics back on the agenda. In the context of double non-taxation, the story is more difficult. Meaningful progress is possible through bilateral cooperation, discussions within the VAT committee, and coordinated infringement procedures. However, these steps alone will not completely eliminate the problem. In the context of double non-taxation, legislative change is required. So this leads me to my final message to you. Lasting progress in EU law is not only achieved through new rules, but also through a willingness to cooperate. In other words, we can and we should work it out. Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor back to the pro-rector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Gerardus. He is Professor of International Tax Law at our university and Chair of the Assessment Committee. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your presentation, and also congratulations to this really very interesting and inspiring work. I think I would like to start with the prevention of decision-making divergences. And in particular, I think this part was very inspiring for me because you suggest various measures which the Court of Justice could take to avoid decision-making divergences. You also mentioned in your presentation now deductive legal reasoning, starting with general principles and then continuing with the specific case facts, but also avoiding inconsistencies by explaining how case law and precedents relate to each other. And when reading and now also hearing your presentation, I was wondering, are those suggestions, in your view, limited to EU VAT law, or are those suggestions not of more general nature, which could be helpful for interpreting all tax directives beyond VAT, and also maybe the fundamental freedoms where the decisions of the Court of Justice also leave room for interpretation and lead a lot to a lot of unclarity. So I would be interested to hear your perspective on that.
Yes. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the nice words. Thank you for your question. So indeed, my thesis addresses prevention through better interpretation, to more coherence and uniformity by the Court of Justice. And I suppose that the limitations in the interpretation of the court that can be found in its current case law are not limited to the field of value-added tax, but may perhaps also appear in other kind of situations. But I think in a more general matter, I argue that interpretation, especially in cross-border situations, should always seek to pursue uniformity. So when I think of other fields where my recommendations might be relevant, I don't think that we should limit the discussion to European law, but for example also to bilateral tax treaties or other situations where we need to allocate taxing powers between various jurisdictions. And in that sense, I think my research has some overlap with your research, in the sense that also in the context of, for example, the interpretation of bilateral tax treaties, I suppose that purposive legal reasoning has its limits. And I think that the same is definitely true in the field of VAT law, because what we see there is that the Court of Justice often tries to find a solution that seems very well fit for that particular situation, to provide an outcome that seems very appropriate in that case, and that perhaps also does justice to the fundamentals of, in this case, value-added tax law, but that at the same time distorts the value of precedent. So I used in my thesis a very good example, I suppose, of the DFDS judgment, where the court sought to cure a situation of double non-taxation, but at the same time created more than 7, I think at this point, 7 judgments that relate to a similar issue, and where the court was required to keep clarifying it. Didn't go well at the beginning. I think it went better after a few judgments. So my comments are indeed not necessarily directed to value-added tax, although that was the object of research, of course, but also to other fields of European law, but most prominently from my perspective of expertise to taxation as a whole. So I hope this answers your question sufficiently.
Yes, thank you very much.
The opposition will be continued by Professor van Kesteren. Professor van Kesteren is Professor of Indirect Taxation at Tilburg University, and we welcome you here at Maastricht.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Yeah. Dear candidate, I really enjoyed reading your thesis, your doctoral thesis. The thesis was very readable, and I learned a lot of it. The overarching theme is clear. We are talking about avoidance of double taxation or non-taxation, and it always relates to a cross-border transaction between 2 member states, and where the member states take a different approach in the interpretation of the applicable rules, and mostly end up in a double taxation or non-double taxation, and that is in itself something that is not desirable. And why it is undesirable can be read in your chapters and paragraphs under the normative framework. Maybe it is the price of not a fully harmonizing VAT system that such situations exist and still exist. And I really appreciate your decision not to resort to simply say that the legislator have to come up with a solution, but that you really look into the current system and that you try to find solutions in the existing rules. And one of your proposals is in your paragraph number 633, where you discuss a maybe less common situation, that there is no difference in the interpretation of the rules, but more in the way member states select the relevant facts. And you speak about the selection of the facts and the analysis of the facts, and there can be the difference in that. And you rightly referred to the decade case, and that is the case that was related to the WebMind licenses case. And the question there was whether the court, at least that was the question of the referring court, is it possible in such a situation where there is no agreement by the member states on the selected facts, whether the court could give guidance there, and the court declared itself not competent, and that it was under reference to Article 267 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. And it declared itself not competent, and also some authors, respected authors, are firmly convinced that the court was right. But now Mr. Klemm comes in, and he says that maybe the Court of Justice did not understand his own rule fully. Maybe the court had an option, even in those circumstances, to come up with a good guidance, useful guidance for the taxable persons involved and the countries involved. So can you give me and the audience here a good, useful guidance on why you think that it is possible for the Court of Justice to come to a good conclusion here?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the compliment. Thank you also for this question. Because it raises, I suppose, a fundamental issue of the court's jurisdiction under Article 267 of the TFEU. And also an issue that is at the heart of my thesis, namely on whether divergences can be resolved or whether they should be resolved. And I think it is undisputed that the court's jurisdiction under Article 267 is to interpret EU law, while it is for the national courts to apply the law and decide in the main proceedings. However, I also think that it's not easy to distinguish between interpretation on the one hand and application on the other. And if we try to look at that distinction, I sometimes see that the term interpretation is construed narrowly, in the sense that it only relates to general statements on the meaning of the law, and that as soon as facts are being included in the equation, that some start to consider that as application. And I find this starting point, I find that too short-sighted, because legal norms always only have meaning in the specific context of facts. So a lawyer will only look at the law with facts in his mind, and it will look at facts through the lens of the rule that is being assessed. So what does that now mean? In my view, it means that the court has some form of discretion when it has to apply its jurisdiction under Article 267. And that discretion also brings responsibility with it, I suppose. And in my view, always when the court is at the point of using its jurisdiction, when a preliminary reference is made to it, it should decide on whether it wants to provide a general statement on the meaning of the law, or whether it should give more guidance to the referring court. And my point in my thesis is, in chapter 6 indeed, is that the court should do everything within its power when it is confronted with a divergence. Because double taxation especially relates difficultly with fundamental rights, double non-taxation with fundamental principles. So when it is subject with such a situation, it should do everything, and that simply means that it should use its discretion to the fullest and give an outcome-oriented judgment. Because I believe that is possible. I used, for example, the Tolsma judgment in my thesis to illustrate this point, where the court interpreted the term for consideration. But ultimately, the decision that it gave was heavily influenced by the facts of the case. They were included in the case. So I think that is clearly an interpretation, and that is an outcome-oriented judgment, and that helps the referring court and the national tax authorities to decide in the main proceedings and give them very little room to maneuver and very little room to drift apart. That this is a good way to look at the jurisdiction, also finds widespread support in the literature. And then, with that all being said, I think we should consider this duodecal judgment of the court, because indeed, what the court did there was it left a situation of double taxation intact. So there was this Portuguese taxable person who was subject to double taxation, and that was not resolved after the court ruled. Because the court effectively declined jurisdiction. It even said that the referring court didn't have to make any reference to the CGEU. And considering all that I have said, I think what the court should have done in this case is provide an outcome-oriented judgment by including the facts and circumstances that were before it, and help everyone as best as it could. And in my view, it could have done that very well. It could have argued that the situations that were before it did not qualify as a abuse of law, and that the recipient of the supply was in fact the Portuguese recipient. So in that case, it would have been clear that the Portuguese authorities' reading of the law was correct, and that of the Hungarian authorities was incorrect. Mm-hmm. And then indeed, as that is, I think, the final point, if I remembered correctly from your question, and then indeed there was also the opinion of Advocate General Cocotte, which has been discussed in the academic literature, and most notably in commentary on it. And what has been stated in the literature was that when the Advocate General said something like, in this specific situation of double taxation, the CGEU must incidentally apply the law. Yep. And then I completely understand that when such terms are being used, that the Advocate General is perhaps a bit off. But at the same time, what I think that the Advocate General wanted to say, also the case law that was referred to, was that it should give this outcome-oriented judgment. So in that sense, the opinion of Advocate General Cocotte is not far off from what I argued in my thesis. So in that sense, I also agree with the Advocate General, and I disagree that it should be considered as an enlargement of jurisdiction.
All right.
So yes.
Yes. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Bomer, who is Professor of Tax and Technology at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And also welcome, and in your case, welcome back to Maastricht.
Okay. Dear candidate, first I would congratulate you on your research. It's a profound and original study. Your study focusing on improving the VAT system without having to change directives and national law. And therefore anyone who knows how difficult it is to amend tax directives in the European Union will understand the importance of your study. However, I do have a few questions that I would like to discuss with you. My question focuses on the role of the European Court of Justice. Your study examines, among other things, the broadening of the scope of interpretation. I wonder whether the Court of Justice is not following a different approach that could help to solve the problem. There are many decisions of the Court of Justice in areas that are not harmonized in directives or regulations. For example, limiting periods, supervision of taxpayers, fines, interest payments, time limits for appeal, etc., etc. Take, for example, the principle of good administration. The court itself has stated that this principle is not based on Article 41 of the Charter of the Fundamental Rights, but that it is a general principle of European law inspired by it. Some of these cases has been incorporated into the Charter of the Fundamental Rights, but most remain case law. This case law defines a formal procedural relationship between tax authorities and taxpayers. In other words, over time, a body of European procedural law has developed outside of directives, regulations, and treaties. With this case law, the Court of Justice aims to ensure the full effect of European law. It can therefore have a disciplinary effect on member states. Your study discusses several of these judgments. However, it does not seem to consider this line of case law as a possible way to solve the problem of double taxation. So my question is, what is your view on this? Would this not be a more effective approach in finding a solution? What is your opinion about that?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the kind words and thank you for your question. So, your question raises this idea that the Court of Justice harmonizes, what could be said as harmonizes procedural law through its case law. And indeed, I think that is correct. You already mentioned interest calculation, limitation periods is one that is important. I suppose fines, rules on evidence, I think is also subject to this form of case law. And what I would like to start with is to argue that I think this is this tendency is legally fine in my view. And the reason is as follows. You already mentioned in your question that the member states are on an obligation to ensure the full effectiveness of European law. That means that they must not hinder the implementation of it. And this legal rule from the Court of Justice, in my view, finds a firm basis in the treaties. So specifically, that is Article 4.3 of the TEU, which obligates member states to do everything within their power to attain union objectives and also refrain from taking actions that could compromise those objectives. So this provision and other provisions, also Article 288, in which the legal basis for directive is provided, these provisions give a responsibility and an obligation to member states to ensure that EU law finds its way into national law and into practice. And in that sense, the Court of Justice harmonizing procedural law fits in that perspective. Why? Because procedural law have the potential of infringing that substantive law can be applied. So by obligating member states to align their procedural laws with these fundamental issues of EU law, so this effectiveness ID, the Court of Justice only says, well, your procedural law may hinder the application of EU law and the implementation of it, and you should ensure that that does not happen, or in any case within proportional boundaries. And not only these constitutional bases provide for that, I think also the protection of fundamental rights, which can be traced back to the case law of the Court of Justice in Rue, but also to the Charter at this point and to the right to an effective remedy. these procedural laws can sometimes hinder effective legal protection. So that is also an element of EU law that guarantees the full implementation in that sense. So, okay, as stated, I think that there are good reasons that the court takes this approach. At the same time, and I think I try to consider that in my thesis, at the same time, I think that the court should be cautious, because clearly a too invasive approach touches upon the autonomy of the member states, their territoriality, their sovereignty. So a balancing exercise is required. And if we put all this into the context of my thesis, I would say that, for example, when I propose some bold ideas as mutual recognition of administrative decisions, or when I conclude that limitation periods should be disapplied, that is always based on this diligent weighing of counteracting forces between, on one hand, the interest of the member state, and on the other hand, the interest of the union, which find their basis in these two provisions. I think another element, what is interesting, you refer to this idea of the principle of good administration, and also the fact that there is a right to good administration in the Charter, Article 41, I believe. So I'm not sure what the case law is you refer to, but in any case, this idea that the court sometimes refers to a fundamental principle and other times to fundamental rights is also visible in other lines of case law. For example, when the court assesses the effectiveness of legal protection, then sometimes the court refers to the effectiveness principle based on case law, the rule effectiveness doctrine, and in other situations the court refers to the right to an effective remedy. And in my view, and I think this finds support in the literature, it's not always clear why the court chooses one option over the other. It seems that in that scenario, effectiveness and effective legal protection are actually quite similar and seem to be interchangeable. And I think that it would be a good idea for the court to base itself more and more on provisions that have a statutory basis, since the introduction of the Lisbon Treaty and the upgrading of the Charter. I think it's wise to transpose its body of case law more into these statutory provisions. So in that respect, I would agree with you. I'm not sure if that was really the point you made, but I would agree with you that the court should more and more adopt its reasoning based on statutory provisions, fundamental statutory provisions, and not on judge-made principles, because they have been transposed. So I hope this answers your question.
Yes, I can follow you. Yes, I can follow you. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. For our next opponent, we will switch online to Austria. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Spies, who is Professor of Tax Law at the Wirtschaftsuniversität Wien. Professor Spies, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Theresia. Dear candidate, congratulations on your work. I very much enjoyed reading the whole book and listening to your presentation. I think it was clear, a very good structure, and you presented the results very clearly in the presentation and in the book. So this was very inspiring. Certain sections of your thesis were very inspiring, also for my thinking. So congratulations on that. I would like to follow up with a question on one of your main results, where you proposed that there could be a principle of mutual recognition of administrative decisions of member states' tax administrations. As far as I understand your main result, you would propose that the tax administration of one member state could be, under certain circumstances, be bound by the decision of another member state to avoid double taxation, but only in the given case if there is already a decision by another member state which is reasonable, then the other tax administration of the other member state should follow this interpretation in order to avoid double taxation, which your reasons to come to this conclusion are based on the principle of sincere cooperation and fundamental rights. My question now would be how this relates to other cases, because your idea would be that this binding, this mutual recognition is limited to the specific case where there is double taxation, which would mean, to my understanding, that in other cases, the tax administration and the domestic court could still apply a different interpretation of the same rule. The same place of supply rule could still be interpreted differently for other cases where there is no specific known issue of double taxation yet, which would mean that the same rule, the same place of supply rule, for example, could be interpreted differently by the same tax administration for different cases in principle. And I was wondering, do you see that this could raise any issues with the principle of equality, for example, or with other general principles under domestic law or under EU law, both equality principle under domestic constitutional law or equality principle under EU law? So that would be my question.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Thank you also very much for the compliment. So indeed, mutual recognition of administrative decisions is, I suppose, one of the core findings in my thesis. And I think it is important to answer your question to go a step back and consider the various doctrines and principles that are counteracting at this point. Because I don't go too lightly. Mutual recognition of administrative decisions means that one member state cannot fully apply what itself thinks is the correct application of EU law. So that means that this reading infringes upon the principle of sovereignty, the principle of territoriality, even the principle of effectiveness of EU law, because one member state thinks that this is the correct application, and any obstacle to that would clearly hinder the member state from doing that and what it believes is to be correct. So there are various and also very foundational principles that stand in the way of my conclusion. At the same time, there's also the protection of fundamental rights. And that is clearly also a very serious matter. Especially when we find out that the protection of these rights cannot be effectively attained by other instruments. So I posited various problems with the preliminary ruling procedure. I'm not going to repeat them because at this point it's less relevant. But in any case, I conclude that there are no other means to combat double taxation in an effective and comprehensive manner. So what we are looking at is, on the one hand, protecting fundamental principles that require that a tax authority can, at its own motion and autonomously, do everything what it thinks is correct. And on the other hand, fundamental rights, which requires that a tax authority takes a step back. And that is also what it does. It requires a tax authority to not execute powers that it does have to begin with. It does have the power to impose assessment, it does have the power to impose an advance ruling, for example, but it doesn't do that. And I think with this observation that also provides the answer to your question. It is not so much that member states are required to adopt a certain approach. They are prohibited to do that in a specific, very specific context where another member state already decided differently and where sincere cooperation requires them to follow them, and the protection of fundamental rights requires them to follow that. And yes, that might have the effect that neutrality is hindered in the sense that competitors may be treated unequally. But at the same time, the situation status quo, situation where a taxable person is subject to double taxation, also clearly hinders those same principles. So with that all being said, I feel confident that indeed the prohibition to execute powers should be accepted, even if that means that a tax authority cannot ensure uniformity in its domestic context. So I hope this answers your question about the opponent.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Eli Antonio, who is Professor of European and Comparative Administrative Law and Procedure at our university. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Per-Rector. Dear candidate, also from my side, many congratulations for having written a most interesting thesis on a topic which is of crucial importance for EU VAT law, EU law, but I dare say the very project of European integration. I'm also particularly grateful to have been asked to read your thesis because although EU tax lawyers might not want to admit it, EU tax law is European administrative law after all. So thank you for having me today. Now, coming to my question. In the conclusion of your chapter 3 and also in your presentation today, you have proposed a number of recommendations when it comes to the interpretative role of the Court of Justice of the European Union to prevent the divergences concerning the recurring legal questions. So you suggest, among others, that the Court should more closely explain how a deviating approach from earlier case law is justified, that it should take on board in the answers questions or aspects of EU VAT law which may not have been explicitly raised by the referring court. So while I entirely agree with you on the fact that this would likely lead to a decrease in divergent national judgments on the same legal point, I would like to ask you today how you would respond to the critique that longer, more complex and more detailed judgment would also lead to a significant increase in the time it takes the court to respond to preliminary questions, with also consequent growing legal uncertainty for applicants at the national level. I checked this morning. According to the official statistics concerning the judicial activity of the Court of Justice in 2024, the average time taken today to deal with references for preliminary ruling was of 17.2 months already. I look forward to your thoughts on this.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Thank you also very much for the compliment. So your question relates to my proposals relating to the prevention of divergences and the activities of the court in that respect, and the prolonging of proceedings. There are various ways that I would like to respond to that. And the first thing is, I fully agree that the caseload before the court is rapidly increasing to a point that it's no longer manageable. There were some transfers to the general court, also including value-added tax, which was one of the consequences of that. And the question could indeed be raised if my proposals would aggravate that problem. But I think there are also reasons to see that my proposals would have a good effect on it. So, for example, I referred to the composite supply doctrine of the Court of Justice that currently includes of 30 judgments. I referred to the case law on share dealings, including 30 judgments. Economic reality, fixed establishments, all these subjects just keep reappearing before the Court of Justice. And they make the case law of the Court of Justice very fit for legal debates between tax authorities on the one hand and tax advisors on the other hand, because it sometimes feels that there are no wrong answers anymore, because I can refer to paragraph 44 of the policy. So I refer to a paragraph that doesn't exist. I refer to one paragraph of a judgment, and my colleague from the tax advisory firm in my capacity as somebody who works for the tax authorities refers to another paragraph of the case law, and then we are completely sure that we're both correct, even though only one of us can be correct. And I think that my proposal, if it would have been adopted to start with, would not have ended up with 30 judgments on whether a holding company is a taxable person or not, or whether the holding of shares is an economic activity, because, truth be told, I don't know. I don't know at this point, even though there are so many judgments, I have no clue if a holding company that is actively involved is carrying out an economic activity. I think I know what the answer should be, clearly, but I don't know if the court still thinks that. The same is true for other lines of case law. Well, I already referred to a few, so I'm not going to do that again. So if the question is raised, does it prolong proceedings? I think for the specific case, yes. Because what I require from the court is more diligence and more responsibility. But from a more general perspective, and I think that is the perspective that increases the caseload before the court, I would answer the question in a negative. I think that my proposals would work the other way around. And in that sense, as a additional note, I'm also not very certain if the transfer to the General Court will really improve the situation. I hope so. We'll see. There's not yet, the last time I checked, the judgment from the General Court on value-added tax, but we will see that in a few years. And I hope that that then I will be proven wrong, but I don't know. So yes, I agree on an individual case, but from the case law considered as a whole, I think that my proposals would actually benefit the caseload. So yes, I hope this answers your question sufficiently.
Yes, thank you very much.
The position will now be continued by Professor van Kesteren.
I have to put on the button. Maybe you will not be pleased by my next question because it relates to a case law of the Court of Justice published after your publication of your own thesis. And I'll now refer to the case X, what is that, the right name? Reality. XI reality case. And in that case, it was a discussion between two countries, of course, two countries. It was between Germany and Ireland. And the question was whether the transaction concerned took place or in Germany or in Ireland. And the German tax authorities, of course, were convinced that it took place in Germany, but it ended up by decision of the Court of Justice that it was taxable in Ireland. And Ireland had no time anymore to levy taxes, so the end result was that there was no taxation at all. So this is a situation of non-double taxation. And then the German tax authorities country thought, all right, but then the VAT that was charged initially in Germany was incorrectly stated on the invoice. So they referred to the application of Article 203, and they said, all right, then maybe that is applicable here, and then we can still levy VAT. And the court said, no, because your clients are non-taxable persons and there is no risk of a tax loss revenue. But from an EU perspective, you can say that there is a risk of a loss of a revenue because there is no VAT levied in both countries. So could have been the court more creative in applying Article 203 in a way that in the end there is at least a taxation in one of the countries. So that's my question to you.
Hi, esteemed opponent. Thank you again for your question. So reference is made to Article 203 of the directive and the XI-reality judgment. And the XI-reality judgment is extremely interesting, of course. It was issued after my thesis, and it just highlights the problem that I was investigating. So in that sense, I'm very happy with the, at least I'm happy with the
Right, thank you for that.
That substantiates the relevance of my thesis. I'm not happy for the treasury of the European Union. I may not be so.
Yeah, sure.
So indeed, double non-taxation ultimately applied because the Irish authorities and the German authorities, after CGU intervention, had a different position. And then your question relates to Article 203. And I think certainly it was a very creative idea of the German authorities to try to tax a transaction that would otherwise not be subject to value-added tax, because in that sense, it functions as a kind of rule that ensures that value-added tax does not slip through the system, which it also does in normal settings when the right VAT would be deducted that would not be paid, which Article 203 remedies. Yeah. At the same time, I think your proposal would really fundamentally alter the nature and the function of Article 203. Because in addition to the CGO case law, which already deals with this question, I think that also the context of the provision and also, if I'm not mistaken, the legislative history of the 6th directive makes clear that the objective of the provision is to ensure that value-added tax that is being deducted is also paid. So there's this clear link with the deduction system. So in that sense, the provision would create a liability that is not foreseen by the legislator and that also increases the VAT payable. And I think that would not be proportional to look at it like that. It would hinder legal certainty and it would hinder legality. It would be at odds with the legality principle. And also there's another issue, I think, now that I come to think of it, which makes it problematic. Because in this specific scenario, invoices were raised to the consumer.
Yeah.
But that is not always the case. You can also supply transactions to a consumer without raising invoices. The value-added tax directive, in any case, does not require you to issue invoices. So if Article 203 would be applicable in the coincidental situation that an invoice was raised to the consumer and would not be applied in the situation that no invoice was raised to the consumer, then its function as a anti-abuse measure, may I call it like that in that scenario, would actually infringe upon equal treatment and neutrality, I suppose. And agreed earlier on the defense, I said that this principle should be disregarded for overriding interest. But in this case of double non-taxation, I don't think that should be the case. So long story short, while I think that it's certainly an innovative idea and also creative, and it would also protect the treasuries of the European Union and also the common means of the European Union, I think that it would be a too far-stretched reading of 203. So in that sense, I agree with the Court of Justice, and I won't agree with the position taken by the German tax authorities.
Yeah, you pushed and stimulate us to be creative, and now I am creative, and that's not good enough. But all right, I fully agree with you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Bomer.
Okay, thank you. Very short question about the possibilities to deviate from the VAT directive. Of course, the VAT is a harmonized tax, but there are many possibilities to deviate from the value-added tax. There are May provisions, for instance, the VAT grouping, but there are many more. And there's also the possibility to use Article 395 of the VAT directive for derogations. So there are many derogations. So it is, if you look closer to the VAT, it is not so harmonized. So my question is, how should this flexibility be taken into account when introducing mutual recognition of administrative decisions?
Yes.
Because in the basis, it is already flexible.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your additional question. Yes, I agree. The value-added tax system is not completely harmonized. It includes of many provisions that give discretion to the member states, May clauses, you name them. And I think when we look at how I define the term decision-making divergence, it refers to decisions that relate to rules that are mandatory. So, for example, the place of supply rules, they leave no discretion to the member states. Other rules also don't leave any discretion to the member states. So when we have a decision-making divergence, it's clearly that we don't have differences in the transposition of VAT law. So in that case, it's comparable to a regulation, and I would say that it's justified.
Mr. Klemm, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company present here today await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. Mathijs Klemm, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Dr. Nellen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Please all rise.
Mathijs.
May I ask you to use the microphone?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Mathijs, yes. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
Then, by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Mathijs Theresia Gerardus Klemm, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached to it by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Mathijs, congratulations.
Please be seated.
Dear all, I will continue in Dutch because what I'm about to say requires me to lose the Dutch language. Be aware. Geachte Dr. Klemm, beste Mathijs, gefeliciteerd. Wat heb je een fantastisch proefschrift geschreven en wat heb je het ontzettend goed verdedigd. Je hebt die dokterstitel dan meer verdiend en Frank en ik zijn ervan overtuigd dat je deze hoogste academische graad met waardigheid zult dragen. De titel van je proefschrift, We Can Work It Out, had je niet beter kunnen kiezen. Het toont de doordachtheid waarmee je als wetenschapper en breder als professional je werk doet. Jij gaat niet over één nacht ijs. Jij wikt en je weegt. En zo is ook de titel van je proefschrift wel overwogen. Jij geeft daarvan zelf aan dat het een knipoog is naar de boodschap die John Lennon en Paul McCartney met dat lied willen brengen. Een boodschap van samenwerking en van wederzijds begrip. Dat sluit natuurlijk prachtig aan bij de kern van jouw onderzoek. Maar, en daar betrappen we je misschien toch op een onbezonnenheid, de titel laat ruimte tot interpretatie. En we weten allemaal, interpretatieruimte leidt al snel tot divergenties. Dat kunnen we niet hebben. De vraag waarvoor Frank en ik ons dan ook gesteld zagen was, waar de nadruk op te leggen. Moeten wij het woord we of het woord can, misschien het woord work of it, dan wel het woord out centraal stellen? Laten we dat eens nader bezien. Ten eerste, als we de nadruk in We Can Work It Out op wie leggen, dan zou je haast denken dat dit prachtige proefschrift meerdere makers kent. Zoals de piramides van Gizeh of de deltawerken. Maar dat is natuurlijk onzin. Dit prachtige boek is uitsluitend het resultaat van jouw intellectuele arbeid. Jij hebt de kus geklaard. En toch is wie hier op zijn plaats. Want een proefschrift wordt zelden in isolatie geschreven. Aan jouw zijde staan een prachtig gezin, familieleden, vrienden, collega's. In je voorwoord geef je zelf ook aan dat ze met je hebben meegeleefd. Je hebben gesteund en geadviseerd. Nou, en als liefhebber van samenwerksverbanden doet mij dat enorm deugd. Een parallel met het Nederlands gebruik in de sport dringt zich overigens ook hier weer op. Want als er gewonnen wordt, dan hebben we gewonnen. En in die zin opgevat, moet de keuze voor dit proefschrift, de titel daarvan, zeer terecht zijn worden geacht. Wat een resultaat. Nemen wij thans het woord kan onder de loep. Can. Het woord can leidt tot enige verwarring. Gaat het nu om can of gaat het nu om kan? Laten wij vooropstellen dat niet iedereen een proefschrift kan schrijven. Maar toen jij aan je proefschrift begon, dachten Frank en ik onmiddellijk, yes, he can. En vervolgens hebben we jou nog eens een keer leren kennen als een doorzitter. En vandaag? Ja, vandaag is alles in kannen en kruiken. En misschien is het woord kan dan ook wel het centrale woord in dit laudatio. Je had het niet beter gekozen kunnen hebben. Ook het woord work is een toepasselijk woord in de titel van je proefschrift. Want werk, dat heb je de afgelopen jaren verzet. Bergenwerk, zo hoog dat de Pietersberg verderop slechts in een kuilend landschap lijkt. Niet alleen je promotieonderzoek heb je met enorme energie verricht. Je hebt onderwijs gegeven, tentamens gemaakt en nagekeken. En je hebt ook nog eens scripties begeleid. En dan hebben we het nog niet eens gehad over je werk bij de Belastingdienst, dat je ook met volle inzet hebt verricht. En met al die arbeid heb je de enorme persoonlijke ontwikkeling laten zien. Was je bij aanvang van je onderzoek nog flink Belastingdienst blauw gekleurd, naarmate je je vorderingen maakte, kwamen daar vele andere tinten bij. Bij de laatste colleges European Value Added Tax heb je zelfs laten zien dat je ook moeiteloos de kleur van een vilijne belastingadviseur kunt aannemen. Jij geeft daarmee een hele eigen invulling aan het chameleon-effect in de BTW. Ten vierde, wat als wij de nadruk op het woord it leggen? Taalkundig beschouwd duidt it op enkelvoud, zoals een echtelijk ruzietje of een kruiswoordpuzzel. Maar in jouw geval slaat it op pluriformiteit en veeltalligheid. Je proefschrift beslaat tegen de 250 arresten van het Hof van Justitie, tegen de 200 wetenschappelijke boeken en artikelen en tegen de 150 overige bronnen. In jouw geval is it een cijfermatig eufemisme van Herculeaanse proporties. Frank en ik hebben uitgerekend dat we wanneer we al jouw bronnen één voor één zouden uitprinten en velletje voor velletje naast elkaar zouden leggen, je 2 keer naar de maan op en neer kan en zelfs dan heb je nog papier over om een omweggetje te maken langs de beste frietkraam van Heerlen, Frituur Willem. Als laatste, ook het woord oud in de titel heeft bij ons tot de nodige vragen geleid. Maar we denken er oud te zijn. Ik zal uitleggen hoe Frank en ik dat zien. Niemand zal raar opkijken als wij jou kenschetsen als bescheiden, onverstoorbaar, integer, intelligent, geduldig en welbespraakt. Maar wij weten dingen die niet iedereen weet. Stille wateren blijken diepe gronden te hebben. Dames en heren, Mathijs blijkt een feestbeest te zijn. Na een gezellige avond tijdens de afgelopen kapgroepweekend was hij de eerste die een taxi instapte om in een duistere kroeg in het centrum van Venlo zijn haren los te gooien. Na een biertje of wat blijkt Mathijs alle Limburgse carnavalskrakers mee te kunnen zingen in eender welk Limburgs dialect. Dat doet hij dan uit volle borst, staande op een stevige tafel, te midden van verbrouwereerde Venlonaren die niet weten wat hun overkomt. Mathijs weet wat uitgaan is. En dat, dames en heren, is naar wij vermoeden de werkelijke betekenis van oud in We Can Work It Out. Beste Mathijs, u zult de afgelopen jaren ontdekt hebben dat ons vakgebied, de BTW, een heel bijzonder vakgebied is. Het is een vakgebied waarin hechte vriendschappen ontstaan en bijzonder goed blijken te gedijen. En als ik zo om ons heen kijk, dan zie ik ook heel wat hechte vriendschapsverbanden in deze zaal. En ook onze vriendschap reikt verder dan die van promotor, co-promotor en promovendus. De lakmoesproef die professor Van Kesteren daar ooit voor heeft ontwikkeld, is of je, louter hypothetisch natuurlijk, bereid zou zijn om samen met ons een bank te overvallen. Nou, met het oog op de gevolgen van zo'n hypothetische overval hebben Frank en ik die proef ooit aangepast naar de vraag of je bereid zou zijn samen uit een gevangenis met ons te ontsnappen. Maar aan jou stellen wij de vraag of je bereid zou zijn om samen met ons op een tafel in een kroeg Limburgse carnavalskrakers te zingen. Louter hypothetisch natuurlijk. Laat ik nu conform een BTW traditie afsluiten door te zeggen dat dit de dag is waarop jij schaamteloos trots mag zijn op jezelf. En waarop Kiana, Benjamin en Jules, je ouders, je broer Wouter, je schoonouders, nee, je hele familie en al je vrienden schaamteloos trots op jou mogen zijn. Geniet daar met volle teugen van. Ik hoop je nog lang bij ons mooie BTW-clubje met Frank, Kim, Chiara, Emma, Galit, Kevin en Govinda blijft. Ik heb gezegd.
Dear Dr. Klemm, also on behalf of Maastricht University and the Faculty of Law, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. Those congratulations also extend to your family members present here today, and thank you for giving him up for such a long time to make all of this happen. A few formalities. When we leave this room in a minute, we will first take a picture together with Professor Spies, who is online, so that we can also have her on the picture with this group. And from there on, after taking a picture at the stairs, we will move to the Refter, where we will have the opportunity to have some drinks and to congratulate our newly formed doctor. Please allow the cortege the courtesy of leaving the room first after the photo has been taken. That being said, I end this meeting and I wish you a pleasant day here in Maastricht.
If needed, huh?